Could you talk a bit about your personal background, your personal history, and how it relates to the war on sense making and the models that you've constructed to understand the world over the last sort of 20 years or so?
It if you notice that what we're engaging in is a very interesting inquiry, because we're attempting to do sense making about sense making. And for me, what that ends up always doing is creating many different layers of awareness of what's happening. So even trying to figure out how to tell the story of how my personal history leads to the inquiry into sense making is, of course, making sense of my story. But broadly speaking, it shows up as I was born in 1971 in Texas, and my father was in the military, but we didn't move around too much. And my mom was college educated, went on to a career in psychology and education, and ultimately politics. And for me, if you know anything about the culture of Texas in the 70s, just assume that's, if you watch the movie Boyhood or Dazed and Confused, just assume that that's the context. And then layer on the fact that I sort of was participating in boy nerd culture in that time. So comic books, science fiction, fantasy, a really OCD level of pop culture, film and television, computers, and role-playing games. And again, pretty obsessively, like a lot. And so this impresses itself upon my psychology. Lots of different kinds of artifacts, things like not just the notion of, say, the way that a person who grew up playing chess thinks about life in the model or the framework of chess, but actually growing up playing every game and thinking about the meta structure that gives rise to games intuitively and how you can drop into any game and be able to derive what it is. And I guess kids these days they sort of naturally think about it, like the idea of calling a game a first-person shooter or calling it a sandbox game has become part of the conventional language. But back then, those concepts didn't exist, so for me, they were built at the level of intuition. But then also things like role-playing, where the notion that the world that you lived in, the narrative structures that gave rise to the way that you made sense of and made meaning in your world, were actually objects of creative participation. And not just a role-playing game, but all of them. So having to figure out how to spontaneously create a 1920s simulator, and how to create a medieval Japan simulator, and how to create a simulator of contemporary New York, but with different natures of reality, was again just part of my developmental environment. And I guess you'd add to that the experience, which I don't think is that atypical, but my particular experience of not being able to play the game that was handed to me fluidly. So the game of going to school, mostly going to school, right? As soon as you show up at I guess, first grade was when I first started beginning to recognize that there was something definitely off. And initially simple things, like the idea that there's an authority who doesn't actually have the capacity that they're supposed to have. Like they're teaching things that are in fact actually wrong. And you can tell that as a first grader, in my case, say a second grader. And then the notion of having to deal with an arbitrary authority that you didn't sign up for, but nonetheless has coercive capacity to force you to do things that clearly suck and, by the way, are stupid. So that idea, that feeling of trying to figure out, like, what the hell's going on here in a sense of constraint. But so the official game, the official story didn't fit. And my developmental environment was teaching me that these things, these kinds of stories, are in fact creative acts. They aren't just the laws of nature. Put me on a journey of trying to figure it out. And figure it out always in a combo between what I suppose we might call sense making and agency. Never just one or the other. Always thinking, okay, how do we figure out what's happening and how do we have agency in what's happening? And if we sort of fast forward to college, this put me in a place where, for example, I didn't really have any particular notion of a major, because that's just a story. and it's not a story that worked for what I was trying to accomplish, so I just hacked that. It was nice that the concept of hacking had become somewhat meaningful in that time frame, and I had participated in hacker culture, so broadly applying the hacker ethos to whatever happened to be there. You're in relationship with a power structure that's stronger than you, but if you can use a combination of cleverness and elegance, you can figure out how to actually make it do the things you want to do and get away with it. This is kind of like the very Gen X temporary autonomous zone hacker cipher freak ethos. We can create a space for autonomy. And in my junior year of college, I ended up coming up with the basis, or the beginnings of my meta theory of particularly of how culture and technology co-create each other, and spent the next, probably 93 to 2007, so the next 14, 15 years kind of playing that out and refining it, building it in medias res. So, I was reading Gilles Deleuze and learning how to do information theory for video compression, for example, or more specifically, actually reading Logic and Sense and learning how to do spreadsheets, actually even more specifically. And so eventually what this leads me to is I figured out another hack, which is a social hack that university is largely credentializing exercise. There's content, and you can meet people, but largely credentializing exercise. And that to be able to move into the economic functions that had the most leverage in the interface between technology and culture, i.e. high-tech entrepreneurship, I needed to get a more legible credential. And a relatively brief search led me to the path of noticing that you could get into law school through the vehicle of doing well on a standardized test and really nothing else. And so I knew from experience that I could do well on standardized tests. So I took a weekend, studied for the LSAT, took the LSAT, low cost. If I got a good score, cool. If I didn't, who cares? I got a good score. This allowed me to get into Harvard Law School, which the law school part you can kind of like tear off the bottom of the diploma and throw away because most people just read the first letter. H. Oh, Harvard, cool. That's neat. You have a credential. So that's what I did. So I spent 3 years, again, more or less not going to law school. I spent most of my time with Larry Lessig and with people like Cornel West and folks like that doing whatever I thought was interesting and continuing to refine the stuff that I've been trying to figure out. Lessig stuff was awesome, like very, very important for me at least, and more broadly back then. And then when I graduated, moved out to California, had no idea, by the way, how the tech industry worked at all, like zero experience. And for example, didn't know that San Francisco was the place to go. I just knew that kind of West was a good directionality. And in San Diego, ended up getting involved in the high-tech scene, ended up being involved in the startup of 3 companies in a row, pretty quickly, right at the froth stage of the .com boom, something called MP3. And then the third company was DivX, which I was the founder and CEO of, and rode that through the bubble popping and then all the way up to the financial crisis of 2008. But it was nice. Like I actually got, on the one hand, to apply the underlying theory, refine the theory in practice, like really seeing firsthand how a lot of these things emerged and went through their arcs, like from inception all the way to maturity through that pace, and ended up with enough resources that I could more or less do what I wanted to. So then I did. And I spent 2 glorious years doing exactly what I wanted to. And in the process of that, largely what I wanted to do was like spend time at a place called the Santa Fe Institute. And by the way, another place called Necker Island. So like 2 very different versions of what I want to. But continued, by the way, basically under the heading of getting a better sense of what's exactly going on. Like, all right, who are these rich people we've heard of? And who are the global elite that we've heard so much about? Well, why don't we just meet them and find out? So I did. And in the context of science, all right, where are the smartest people doing the most interesting work in the broadest way? Oh, they're here. Okay, cool. Let's go spend time with them as well. But then the financial crisis hit, and I happened to be just sitting there at a place where I could ask questions. And so I started asking questions. And I was in this really interesting place where I was literally at a conference at SFI when I think like the Dow dropped 800 points, 900 points, and 1,000 points like day after day after day, which had the consequence of getting a lot of attention And I was able to watch the story that was being told through MSNBC and through official channels. I was able to ask the actual Nobel Prize winning economists who just happened to be like right there, what's actually going on. And I was able to then witness the gap between the official story, what was really happening, and the fact that the economists had no fucking idea. Like even their underlying models were just whack. So I got interested, and so I started digging, and I just more or less followed my nose. I read all the books on money theory, for example, and David Graeber's book, by the way, is fantastic and blows a lot of concepts, particularly the legitimacy of the economic discipline, out of the water. And of course, I also read other things like complexity economics. But it doesn't stop there. Once you start getting into complexity, the first thing you learn is that everything's connected to everything else. So if you want to do economics, you also have to look at the interface between economics and politics. I think yesterday we talked about the 4-layer model that talks about the path. You can, for example, model finance, economics, politics, and culture as being distinct layers that feed back on each other in a very complex fashion. But that if you have a financial crisis, you can actually allow that financial crisis to happen at the finance level. And while it will have impacts at the economic level, it may not necessarily have any meaningful impact at the political level. It may even strengthen the political level. Or you can do what we did, which was you can actually more or less bail out, well, both metaphorically and practically bail out the financial level by spending cultural currency, meaning breaking people's underlying trust at the political level, and then ultimately even at the cultural level, which is to say people's sense of being part of the same cultural fabric. Greece, for example, I think has had a lot of that. And of course, again, watching that in real time. So again, a place of being able to be front and center with the unfurling of reality. And by the way, having skin in the game. My large pile of money that I'd made by being a tech entrepreneur became a smaller pile of money as a result of the financial crisis. So I wasn't, what's the right term?
Disinterested.
I was not disinterested. I was quite interested and a bit pissed off, to be perfectly frank. And I got even more pissed off as I continued watching what was happening, because it was, to me at least now, increasingly obvious that the choices that were being made at the level of how our collective choice making worked, let's say, for example, at the level of politics, were bad, like actually bad, like they would have long-term negative consequences. And just kept on going deeper. And then I found myself in a situation where I had a series of significant oh shits, where I would have conversations with people who were really like the expert in some particular domain of interest, say, for example, nuclear proliferation, or the concentration of estrogen in amphibians, like very narrow, specific domains. And I had probably over a period of about a year, a series of conversations, each one of which was, things are really terrible. Like there's something going on that is way bad, like nuclear proliferation. The likelihood that we will be able to keep the world from having a quite significant bad nuclear event over the next decade is very low, like 5%. Like sitting there with like the 3 experts in the world on that question, and they're all nodding their heads saying, yeah, this is fucked. Like this is really a serious problem. And then it's taking literally one step back and noticing that that fact does not seem to propagate out of that room. And then beginning to get my meta model relationship between culture and technology, now just plugging more in. The relationship between politics and technology, and between communications and politics, and between environmental and between the whole thing. And beginning to notice that I seem to be one of the very few people who was talking to all these different groups and trying to see how the chain fit together from beginning to end, top to bottom, and how everything's synthesized. And what happens when you start thinking about changes in rainfall and temperature impact on food with populations and politics. What impact does migration have on political stability? What impact does political stability have on financial stability? Like, watching the cascade effects. And somewhere around, I guess, 2012, came to the conclusion that the thing that we're operating in, whatever the container is that keeps the world held in a somewhat functioning system, is end of life. And there's theoretical ways to describe exactly why, exactly what it is, exactly why, and exactly what we might be able to do about it, which, by the way, is very little in the context of itself. Right? So we've reached the end of life of a deep premise on how to go about being humans together in relationship to the world. And we're seeing this come to fruition everywhere. And by the way, I mean everywhere. I can even literally describe Hollywood blockbuster films in this model, and video games. So, okay, so then the next couple of years was, given that, let's get back to actuation. So into sense making, let's take what might we be able to do? And this gave rise to a project that became called Game B, which some people have heard about, which is actually kind of neat, because there were ultimately about 30 or 40 people who were involved in that project, and we weren't able to get to where it needed to get to in and of itself. So we dissolved the project in, I think, 2013 or so, maybe 2014. And the fact that the concepts have propagated out is actually a very interesting reality, but not vastly. And means that kind of gets us more or less where we are.
So the story that I've heard you sketch out is that you have been a tech entrepreneur for many years, which has given you the ability to then kind of detach a little bit, take a bit more of a bird's eye view and speak to people who really know what's going on in the culture, try to understand and put the pieces together. One of the things that I've heard you talk about a lot is the crisis of sense making, which in some sense seems to be underneath all these other crises, because if we can't make sense of the world, it's very difficult to know what we should do next. So how would you describe the crisis of sense making?
What I'd like to do first is maybe establish a method. And in the method that I would propose is one of having a kind of attentional parallax, which is to say that we're going to talk about it, and we're also going to be doing it, and we're going to be aware of both. So we have a couple of different perspectives going on simultaneously. So what I'd invite is to be able to sort of notice that fact, and if you can, try to split your attention into 3 distinct pieces and try to be aware of all 3 simultaneously. Now, in the context of, let's call it the big question, the situation, where are we? One of the things that we'll notice is that when we're engaging in a narrative, we end up having to take a slice. Like, our attention is finite, really quite distinctly finite, and our capacity to engage in conversation has some linearity to it. It may be wandering, but it has a reality tunnel-esque effect. But the problem that we're in isn't. It's whole. It's a wholeness to it. It's a whole system. And I don't want to use the strictly physical, but it's a wholeness. So we find ourselves in a circumstance where we have to use just a lens, a perspective, but be aware of the fact that what we're trying to do is actually grasp a whole. And it's a little bit like that, well, at least my version, or my take on that story of the blind men and the elephant, where if the blind men take their perspective as being the whole, they're making an error, right? The tusk turns into a rhino and the foot turns into a tree. But if the blind men are able to recognize the distinction between the narrow, finite perspective that they're holding and the notion that they're trying to grasp a whole, and then they communicate with each other, they establish a parallax, then they can in fact perhaps grasp the whole. Oh, it's an elephant. And there's something about that that is very much more than just the sum of their particular perspectives, in fact a lot more in this case. And we can even maybe enrich that metaphor by saying, okay, well, we generally, when I say it's an elephant, what will end up happening is we'll actually have a visual take. We see the whole elephant, right? The blind men are blind and they feel pieces. And we perceive seeing the whole elephant as somehow seeing the whole. But of course we're not. We're seeing the exterior as reflected by light when we're seeing. We're not seeing the interior of the elephant. We're not seeing its blood pumping. We're not seeing the micro level of the metabolic processes. We're not seeing the genetic code converting into proteins. We're not seeing the developmental history of the elephant through its lifetime as an elephant. We're not seeing the evolutionary history of the becoming of elephantness in world, which is part of the whole. Right? So it's interesting. If we grasp the relationship between the parts that were perceived by the blind men and the whole that we could perceive when we saw, and then noticing that whole that we see is actually a part of a whole, and we just try to kind of absorb that and take that as almost a moral lesson in how to tell the difference between parts and wholes, then we can talk about the crisis of sense making, because it is a part of a larger story. But a big answer to the question is being able to separate between parts and wholes and actually learn how to perceive through wholeness. And that last part has a lot of richness to it, I think. So, there's a lot of different ways to start this. And I think I'll just kind of start near the end and then teleport to the beginning. So near the end, we have a problem. And that is, if we want to be able to respond to our environment, if we want to be able to make good choices and execute on our actions effectively, it's useful to know what the fuck's going on. This is particularly true when we're dealing with multiple people and we're trying to get us all to work together. And we're in a situation where the magnitude, the complexity of the problem domain that we're dealing with is very large and getting larger by the minute. And at the same time, the way that we go about knowing what's going on together is actually, at its best, isn't up to the task. At its best, could not make sense of what was happening, and is actually getting worse and worse every day. So if we need to be here, we're here, we're going that way, and the problem's getting bigger. So I would consider that to be a...
Because of ever-increasing complexity?
No. We get to that in a moment. We'll take that as a whole piece. And yes, by the way, but it's complex to explain why that's the case. But just by itself, we can just take a look at the degrading functionality of our sense-making systems as its own story. And then we can talk about the increase in complexity of our environment as its own story. And then we can actually talk about how those two pieces actually fit together in a larger story. So that's where we are now. So if we talk about the crisis in sense-making, we're really trying to get to the edge of it. Like, why does that land? Why is that a meaningful proposition? What I would say is that we can't make sense of what's going on. And I mean this in almost any way. Like, we can't make sense of climate change. We can't make sense of financial instability. We can't make sense of why politics is unrolling the way that it is. We can't make sense of gender. We can't make sense of why we can't make sense of gender. Right? We're rapidly moving in the direction of having a very hard time making sense about anything at all. And the urgency, the level of meaningfulness, the level of impact, the level of consequence of the need of us making sense is increasing. And so we're in a situation where we actually have to be really, really good at making choices because they're very powerful in the context of our world. And so that means our sense making has to be vastly better than where it is right now, and soon. Otherwise, we're likely going to be experiencing the phenomenon like wheels coming off. Small perturbations creating bigger perturbations, creating a destabilization in both sense making and harder choices, leading to a race effect into catastrophe. So that's a crisis. So that's what I mean by crisis in sense making. So maybe now we can teleport back and do some basic models, like some basic notions. And I actually did this in the Blue Church essay. So what I want to introduce is some concepts around coherence. And yeah, I'll do maybe 2 turns on it at different levels of scale. So let's just begin with one eye. You've got one eye, and that gives you a certain level of perception. And then you have 2 eyes. And you may notice that 2 eyes are better than 1. In fact, a lot better than 1. So then you might think, well, and all right, so stop there. So 2 eyes are better than 1, but it's actually quite important that they're not independent. It's crucial that they be bound into a visual field. You notice that you actually don't see 2 eyes, you see one reality. So they are coherent. So there's a capacity to have diversity of perspective in this case, and also to integrate it into a wholeness of perception. So those are all part of the same chunk. So you want to have is an increasing diversity of, in this case, perception, while maintaining an integrated wholeness of perception. And that combination I'm going to call coherence, of perception at least. So then what you might do is you might want to add a third eye. And that's cool. I mean, flies have multiple eyes, that's neat. But here's a better move. Add hearing, add ears. If you add hearing to vision, that's a lot better than just having three eyes, because you've modally shifted. You actually have qualitatively different perceptive capacities. And you might notice that, for example, a very large amount of seeing doesn't really help you at all in the domain of hearing, and vice versa. So, modal increase in perspective capacity, and then still being able to integrate that into a wholeness of perception. Of course, this is just experiencing reality. That's one story, right? That's one story of coherence. And I'm using that to give you a sense of it in your own body. Right? So your body is a coherent entity at the level of perception. You have many different modes and many different kinds within those modes, 2 ears, 2 eyes, that are integrated into a coherent wholeness that gives rise to your perceptive capacities. And we'll get back to that, by the way, because the individual human body is important in this story. But then we can step it up. Let's now take a group. And now I'm going to combine both perception and action, because of course your body does that, but we'll do it in a group. In the Blue Church essay, I talked about it in the context of rowing a boat. So in the beginning, let's say you're trying to canoe. So you have one oar, and you have to have the effort of getting the physical motion of putting the oar in the water and pulling it and not tipping over the boat. And so that's a set of functions, a set of different kinds of perception and actuation capacities. You have to have some sensitivity to how your weight is affecting the weight of the boat and how your arms are moving the oar into the water. But as an individual, as a body which is coherent, it's a relatively straightforward thing to do. And you can notice this when you go from one oar to two. You go from a canoe to a rowboat. That once you add the second oar, it takes a little bit of time to figure out how to get them all together, but in not too long, you can become coherent. You can bring 2 oars into coherence. You can take the sensitive sensing of muscle to oar to feeling when they're in the water and pulling it in the motion of the boat, and you integrate it, and it pops. You have an insight, which is just that you bring into your body the wholeness of that, and you've integrated that into a coherent whole. And you can now actuate rowing the boat. But now you add another person into the boat, and notice that there's a significant difference there. That 2 people rowing a boat is a harder thing. That you have to use communication, and you have to actually practice substantially more. You have to get a sense, an embodied sense, and feeling, and say you're just rowing a canoe, because it's a little bit easier. The person in the front, the person in the back. You may even have official divisions of labor. The person in the back is steering while the person in the front is, just rowing. The person in the back's in charge. Like, there's a big bunch of stuff that has to happen that enables 2 people to come into coherence. And you may be able to scale that to, say, 3 people. But at a certain point, you actually start seeing a phase transition where, and particularly now switch it to rowing with 2 oars, so you've got 3 people in the boat. You really do have to start doing division of labor to maintain that. You have to actually have the guy in the front, I suppose, who's yelling stroke. Because otherwise, the ability of the individuals to stay coordinated, to stay perception linked to action in a fashion that is acting as an integrated whole, is not up to snuff. Like, we as humans haven't got the capacity to be able to maintain that much complexity with our embodied sensorium without trying to simplify the task. So we do. We simplify agency. We actually compress the agency and the perception and the actuation agency. So what happens is you now become an instrument. You no longer have full agency over your choice making or your perception. You don't decide when to stroke. You just do it when told. And if everybody now is acting in that actuation function, and the person up front is doing at least a mediocre job of keeping a good rhythm, suddenly you're now coherent again and able to go much faster. Hence the trireme, the big guy with the drums. That's my vision. I'm not British, so I don't have the Oxford notion. Okay, so that's a framework. Now, the reason why I want to roll out that framework is that this dynamic between complex coherence, your body integrated as a whole, and what I'm going to call complicated coherence, which is this relation of simplification and actuation through some kind of structure, is a big part of the rollout of what I've come to call Game A, which we might also call civilization. If you want to sort of start at 15, 20,000 years and up to 10 years from now, that story. And it's a story where, just like moving from one person to three people to seven people, and moving from one hour to 2 hours, is a story of an increase in the nature of the lived environment that our structures of sense making and choice making and actuation are endeavoring to be coherent in, and to therefore give us the capacity to operate in effectively as a group. Okay, so you can then use this to go decompose, take a look at Bronze Age psychotechnology, as John Vervaeke, I think, is right now very lucidly articulating this notion of psychotechnology and how it rolls out. And you can look at the transitions of when that particular toolkit fails, how it turns into collapse, how in the intermezzo of that collapse there's a new liminal experimental phase of building up new toolkits that are able to handle the complex problem of all the diverse elements of the new state of affairs. Larger population, new technologies that you have to deal with, different environmental constants. Integrating that into some kind of new coherent whole through some kind of set of technologies for doing it, and then how that does what it does. And broadly speaking, in a triadic relationship, it has to be able to be responsive to nature, has to be able to feed itself and survive the winter, has to be able to be responsive to other things like it that may tend to take its stuff away, and it needs to be able to maintain its internal integrity, not fall apart from the inside. And of course, the broad story of Game A has been different efforts to figure out how to solve that problem and how they fail. And then how we, pick up the pieces and put them back together again and try to kind of go back into it. So we can then tell the story of that story. We can zoom all the way back to the Paleolithic transition and work our way through step by step. And that's a very good, useful thing to do. And I think John's narrative and my narrative are very connected. And they're two very nice parallax perspectives. If you take his entire perspective and you take the one that I could roll out today if you'd like, and notice that there are two different perspectives on a whole, and then try to grasp the whole, which both he and I are urging you to do, then you're in a really good place. And there's other people who are doing the same kind of thing. And that's, I think, is the key, is to be able to recognize that they're each perspectives on a whole, which happens to be, by the way, reality. And if you're able to hold that notion of wholeness and then allow the perspective to give you sensing into what the wholeness might be, then you can start dropping into deeper insight about the nature of the whole and then begin to be able to make better choices. So I'm tempted right now to kind of drop into the Blue Church story. Just kind of fast forward. We'll fast forward from the Axial Age.
Yeah, I mean, the question that comes up when you talk about Game A, is Game A synonymous with the Blue Church?
No. Game A is the larger...
But in terms of a structure to create coherence, that's the Blue Church.
Blue Church is the very specific solution to the problem during the time frame between roughly 1930 through 16. And so it's in much the same way that, say, pre-Aristotelian Athens had a solution to the problem. The Blue Church is a historically specific solution to the problem, of which Game A is the general category.
Of establishing coherence.
Of establishing coherence, and very particularly using complicated systems, if we want to be precise. Right? So using some combination of simplification and causal mechanism to be able to establish coherence in perception, in meaning making, and in actuation. So that's Game A. And let me give it a little bit more precision on what I mean by that. So we talked about as a rower, when you shift from being a fully autonomous free agent to being the guy who just does what he's told, that's what I mean. Right? So simplification and bounding choice within a very causal context. So if you remember Henry Ford's story, you can choose whatever color you want as long as it's black. It's that kind of an idea. You take choice, the human capacity to have free will, to make choice, and you put it in a box. You get a very specific set of input outputs. You make it machinic. Right? You can say that game A is a machinic structure. It is fundamentally computational in nature. And of course, it's always complicated by the fact that it's always in relationship with nature, wild nature, human nature. But it, in and of its essence, is of that sort. And so every bureaucracy is an effort to do that, right? You want to have very well-defined processes that have very well-defined inputs, very well-defined outputs, and then the human agents you put into the box have choice within that box. And so you can put the bottle cap on the bottle or not, but that's it, right? That's what you do on the assembly line. Or what is it? You file the weenus and you check one of 3 boxes and then you put it out there. Or you fill in the spreadsheet and you input an output. Or you try to turn human agency into effective delivery of choice making in the context of a broader system that is computational in nature. And the reason for that, of course, is to simplify. You radically simplify the amount of complexity that each individual has to hold, and you try to therefore create a system that has enough information processing and actuation capacity to manage complexity. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to manage complexity with a complicated system. That is game A. There's a couple other ways of looking at it, but that's a very good way of looking at it. And so what we find is, over time, and remember there's 3 different dimensions. You have in relationship with nature, with the world, in relationship with other people who are trying to play that same game, and in relationship with your interiority, with how your interior system of people doing peopleness, which is complex, is working out inside. And what I mean by that, people doing peopleness, you have things like defection and self-dealing and corruption and, well, stupidity and fill in the blank. Like the whole complexity of being human has a corrosive effect on the well-functioning of your social machine. And then the competitive pressures of, let's say, the Chinese, who are rolling out sesame credits to try to make their machine more functional. What do? Well, if their machine is better than your machine, they can take your stuff. And that may end up being catastrophic to your machine. And then, of course, nature. You know, if it turns out that we no longer can grow food, then it's not a very effective machine. And we have stories. We have stories like the Tainter curve that talks about how and why these kinds of complicated social machines break down in the context of nature. That we can, go into ad nauseum if you'd like, and we could talk about why they fail.
I think the segue into the Blue Church was good.
Ah, yes. Okay. So now we're going to move to the Blue Church. Yeah. So what we do is we have if you don't mind, maybe I'll just recapitulate that story. I think I can do it pretty quickly. Yeah. So we're exiting what I call the Victorian synthesis. We're talking the time frame roughly 1850 to 1910 or so. And we're entering into a period of chaos. There's actually a little collapse that happened right there. It's not a Bronze Age collapse. It's a pretty decent collapse. That period from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, which you may remember kind of sucked. And a lot of stuff happened. Like a lot of change occurred in that context.
The Titanic always feels like this kind of weird harbinger of that.
That's because you watched Downton Abbey.
The Titanic seems like a weird harbinger of
it's
what
nice.
Happened afterwards.
It has that archetypical feeling of a portent. Yeah. And of course it is, right? It's saying, hey, Victorian synthesis, complex reality is still out there, and you have not yet, in fact, conquered it. Which I think is kind of the moral lesson. Of course, then World War I was a demoralization of the sense of mastery, the sense that complicated had finally mastered the complex, largely in the context of humanness. And then we got to delve into the meltdown of culture, mostly in Germany, but elsewhere. And then we got to delve into what happens when culture melts down. And then we got to build the Blue Church. Right? So coming out of World War II, we have a new state of affairs. So a new set of problems, a new set of capacities with which to engage in trying to bring the complicated into relationship with the complex. So we have the mass production, so the movement of industrial, like trains to cars. And in post-World War II, mass production of cars, like the invention of the ability to produce a lot of it. And so the significant economic dislocation that that involves, and the massive wealth, at least in the US, and then ultimately percolating out into the quote unquote first world. You have mass media, and you have the ability first, in the earliest stages, mostly radio, but then transitioning very quickly, and for the dominant period of the Blue Church television, right, which has lots of characteristics. And maybe we'll probably zoom in on that because it's so important. But let me do a few more. You have education. The formal structure of, like, for example, the missile gap during the Kennedy years to vastly increase the intensity of expenditure and effort on college education. Like, the number of kids who went to college through the arc of the Blue Church went from, I think, like 20% to 85% or something like that. So it's significant. And the normalization of education, because obviously when high school is no longer a end of itself, but is part of a larger story, it now becomes entrained to a bigger structure and now becomes normalized as a single object. A lot more people. You know, the population went from 100 million in the US to 300 million during that arc, so it's a lot. And a lot of urbanization. And by the way, mixing of demographics, because you had the interstate highway system allowed people in cars to drive around. So you had the massive diaspora of moving from city centers into the suburbs and moving from the east to the west and the south. So a lot of change happened. And the Blue Church emerged in the context of having to figure out how to navigate all of these changes and generate coherence. How do we get all of these people with these new capacities to be able to make sense of the world in some fashion that is able to then make choices together and to act effectively? Right? That's the question. And the Blue Church developed to be the answer to that question. Right? So it developed the ability to say, for example, use the education system to establish an embodied sense of vertical meritocratic hierarchy. Right? The idea that some people are better at others in knowing certain kinds of things. We can find them, and then we empower them to have hierarchical authority in the structure that we're in. And I should say this, by the way, both formally and informally. You know, the role of being in class is teaching that. Whether the content of the story of the class, whatever the content of the class is, the experience of the student is the teacher's in charge. Our job is just to listen. And some of us are smart, and they get to be teachers or in charge, right? That's the story of school. And it's very important, that first part, that there's a relationship between authority and receptor that has a broadcast modality. So the Blue Church is very broadcast across its entire mode. So what I mean by broadcast, of course, is exemplified in television, which is to say that some small number of people get to speak, and a very, very large number of people get to listen. And this is very different than say, what we're doing right here. This is symmetric. While, of course, I'm the one speaking, in principle, there's nothing about this conversation that couldn't be perfectly symmetric. But in television, in any kind of broadcast modality, it's structurally that way. So Walter Cronkite tells the news, and everybody else watches it. And there's a lot of passivity there. Like, my job is not to perceive what's going on, make sense of it, and then express it in the world. My job is to see the story that I'm being told and be able to then express that story effectively in the society that I'm in. And I call this good sense, the emergence of good sense. And you see an emerging mesh of good sense. You know, who are the authoritative speakers, whether they're NBC News or they're the New York Times? And there's a diversity, of course. There's a variety of different perspectives in the authoritative framework. The Blue Church recognizes the necessity of having eyes and ears, but it also recognizes the necessity of having coherence. So there's a diversity, but there's a diversity within a particular boundary. And so when you show up in society, if you are speaking good sense, if your expressions are of the sort that everybody else has broadly been hearing, or the authoritative statements, then you're showing up well. And if you aren't, then you're showing up poorly. And you'll notice that. Like, if you begin to say things that are contra-narrative in a deep way, even today, much less so now, though, than like 30 years ago, then you will notice a discomfort. People get uncomfortable, viscerally, physically. And you will notice that discomfort viscerally, physically, and then you'll stop doing it. And so there's a nice policing mechanism that just at the cocktail party set, particularly in places like, say, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, where the elite cachet is the most important, where the choice of social success is the choice between being elevated in the hierarchy or not, then good sense becomes even more self-policing.
Good sense or good opinion?
Sorry, good opinion. Thank you. Good opinion. And it's actually interesting to make that distinction, because the effort of the Blue Church is actually to provide good sense. Right? What is the truth about the war in Vietnam? But of course, what it can only produce is good opinion. What is our perspective? And then make sure that everybody more or less has that. Because then you can actually have choices. You can actually make choices together. If we all more or less agree that this is the nature of reality, and we more or less agree that these kinds of actions will lead to effective results, then we're rowing the boat to the coxswain's yell. We're pushing. We have a menu that has 6 buttons. Pick which button you'd like to push. You have choice, no question. But it's in a constraint. Right? It's within a boundary condition that works. And then what happens is when you push the button, it actuates a whole lot of stuff. We've all decided that we're going to have a war on poverty. So we turned the dial on the World War II era bureaucratic machinery that took us to the moon, that built the interstate highway system, and we said, okay, go out and point that engine at poverty. We're going to start building the welfare state. Go. Right? And that's what they did. And sometimes it worked. You pointed it at the moon and it got us to the moon. You pointed it at poverty and it didn't work. It really created a mess. And that tells us a lot, by the way. So I guess kind of that's that. Like, that's the Blue Church. And there's an entrainment, because this structure has Harvard is kind of at the top, and then you have the rest of the Ivy League and Oxford and Cambridge. I'm sad to say that the UK lost their position. The Victorian synthesis was a UK-centric. The Blue Church was a US-centric global sense-making system. And it was broadly global, of course, through the first 3 quarters. There was the Eastern Bloc that was doing their own thing. But starting in the late 80s, totally global. And for a little bit of time there, in fact, actually functionally global. And that period from 88 to maybe 1999 was a period where the Blue Church was a true hegemon and was doing stuff. And
what constitutes the Blue Church? You mentioned Harvard, but it'd be good just to sketch out.
It's an interesting way of asking the question. So I thought I was just telling you. So the set of ways of going about making sense, broadcast modality, formal good opinion, structures of hierarchy, that's constitutes the Blue Church in terms of who's part of it, who has hierarchy in the Blue Church, I think is the question you're asking. Who has authority? Harvard, Ivy League universities, some of the sort of bigger think tanks, the Rand Corporation, significant governmental entities like the Department of Defense, NASA, the CIA in different domains, large corporations, GM, GE, back in the day, when that was like when what's good for General Motors is good for America. It's a very Blue Church kind of concept. It shifted to the tech sector for a little bit. Microsoft and Apple and that kind of a thing had a little bit of cachet. Some of the media structures like the New York Times, the Washington Post, really called the paper of record. The more formal, authoritative broadcast television programs, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN for a while, like in the heyday. You could look at that second tier going on in the quote-unquote allies. I think Japan is probably third tier, to be perfectly frank. So the UK is very much in the second tier. Oxford, Cambridge, The Guardian. I don't actually know what some of the other... I'm sure there are other equivalent, like Tavistock or something, that have think-tanky functions in the UK. The various papers of record in Germany and France, and their governments, like literally their entire government, has second-tier status vis-a-vis, say, the DoD in the US. So it's that kind of a structure. So it's the usual suspects. It's not that hard. You think, who knows stuff? There's a certain question you have to ask. Who are you going to ask? Who do you think will be able to answer that question effectively? Who will, if they tell you that 17 intelligence agencies agree that you believe is telling you the truth? The Encyclopedia Britannica is a very churchly function. The idea that what is it called? The American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, those kinds of things. Nobel Prize winners are very Blue Church, which is actually quite interesting. Eric talks about that a bit. There's a certain special arc in the sciences where you get this special badge that gives you cachet that is broad. what's the guy's name for the New York Times who writes the economics?
Paul Krugman?
Paul Krugman. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist, which means he gets to talk about anything he fucking wants to, and somehow is special, genius. Which sometimes is true, and sometimes it's not. By the way, just to add, the Federal Reserve is a big one. The IMF is a big one, as part of the Blue Church. The Council on Foreign Relations is a big one. And by the way, these are just like real things. Like the CFR was something that was started in the 1930s as a bunch of smart people in New York thought, hey, if we get together, we can make things happen that are better than if we don't, and just kind of iterate on that. And they're kind of like the cocktail party set, but there's a feedback loop. Remember, I mentioned that I actually did some case studies. I actually went to places where fancy, rich people hung out, mostly Aspen and Necker, and other places like Hollywood. And what I noticed, at least my first person experience, was that there is absolutely for sure an elite conspiracy, which is just they all kind of hang out in the same place and like each other. But it has a characteristic. If 3-4 people, one of whom happens to be in charge of Deutsche Telekom, one of whom happens to be in charge of British Telecom, one of whom happens to be in charge of a global investment bank, one of whom happens to be a successful entrepreneur who just is looking for something to do, and they're hanging out at a dinner table in Aspen, and they just start shooting the shit. They don't have a lot to talk about because there's only certain things that they actually do, which is business and politics, but mostly business. So they start talking about business, and it turns out that if there's an opportunity for Deutsche Telekom and British Telecom to sell their mobile divisions into a new company that the bank will fund and this guy will run, you'd be surprised how rapidly that gets surfaced and identified as a thing to do. Now, growing up in the Texas Hill Country, I wasn't having those kinds of conversations, and I think most people don't. So that's an example, right? That's an artifact that emerges out of the notion of the Blue Church, that once you have a vertical hierarchy, and then by definition you have a finite amount of time, you get clusters of these people who are hanging together. And then, by the way, a lot of that human complexity creeps back in. They start having clubs, cliques. They start caring about each other. And they also start getting a lot of groupthink. That good opinion starts to really solidify, and they become blind to what's not within that good opinion. Yeah, in fact, so at this point, let me introduce another concept. It's kind of a deep concept, but it's very useful, and then it'll help us navigate the transition of what's happening. So here, the concept is, it's a bundle. So what we're going to do, fitness landscapes. We're going to do the idea of excellence and remarkability. And then we're going to do niche construction. Okay? I don't think it'll take that long. Very helpful. So fitness landscape is a concept that originated in evolutionary theory, biological evolutionary theory. But evolutionary theory has become more and more meta, so it covers a much more abstract functions. The fitness landscape is an abstract concept. And what it describes is where you have agents that have resource needs and will find themselves in conflict with each other and with the environment to acquire their resources and have agency, then certain kinds of things are going to happen. And the landscape describes what strategies, what kind of approaches, what kind of agentic choices or capacities to make choices will end up being successful. And then, as it turns out, if effective strategy can be passed down, either moment to moment or child to parent to child, then you start getting concentrations around good strategies, because those who are successful repeat. So, if you look at a fitness landscape, for example, in the Arctic, the strategy of being a dark black rabbit is poor, and so you might think of it as a valley. It's a very low fitness choice, and so nothing survives for very long down there. Whereas the strategy of being a perfectly white fuzzy bunny is good, so it's a very high point. And if you imagine you were to change the fitness landscape, so take my two bunnies and shift them to be, say, in the desert, well, maybe it's a brown bunny, just to make it a better metaphor, sand brown. The bunnies are the same, the landscape just inverted. So now being a bright white fuzzy bunny is bad, and you're going to die out, and being a brown jackrabbit is good, and you'll survive, right? So that's the relationship. So then, if you imagine that fitness landscapes have a certain topography and a certain variability. So topography meaning, what's the shape of the hills? Is there one big hill right in the middle, or are there a whole bunch of little hills? And what's the space in between them? And how long do they last? Is it fluctuating wildly, or is it just like one massive hill forever? And I'm going to define a concept called excellence. I think Brett Weinstein actually uses different terms, so I'll just define them. But I'm pretty sure he does. I'm pretty sure he uses the right terms, but I'll use my terms. So excellence here refers to a strategy which is about climbing the hill you're on and getting very good at holding the top. So if I'm on a landscape that is defined by a small number of large hills and that doesn't change very much, excellence is a very good strategy. If I happen to be near the bottom, vaguely near the bottom of a good hill, then what I do is I climb all the way to the top and then I stay there. Saber-toothed tiger, Goldman Sachs banker, right? Excellence. So then the next concept is remarkable, associated with valley crossing. Sorry, that's the formal term. So if I'm in an environment where there may be, in fact, many hills that maybe aren't so tall, or just many hills, and or a lot of variability, then excellence starts to be a pretty poor strategy because there's a lot of competition trying to get to the top of that one big hill. Everybody's right there, so it's hard to get to the top. And particularly if you aren't the very top, being third or fourth tier really sucks. If it's possible for me to go down for a little bit, which isn't great, but to get across to a different hill where there's less competition, that's awesome. So this is the remarkable strategy, the valley crossing strategy. It's a very different strategy. And equivalently, if it turns out that we're all on this big hill and then it goes away, whoever had the capacity to go somewhere else wins, survives, and who didn't evaporates. The saber-toothed tiger goes extinct. And it turns out these two strategies have a certain tension. So if you're really optimizing for excellence, one of the things you'll have to do is get rid of your remarkableness to make room for more excellence. You become a saber-toothed tiger or a Tyrannosaurus Rex. If you're really optimizing for remarkableness, you don't have room for the specialization of excellence, and so you're not going to be able to be as effective. So then we add finally niche construction. It's very important. So niche construction is your strategy is not just responsive to the niche passively, it's able to feed back on the niche actively. And so you're able to transform the fitness landscape into something that, by hypothesis, you prefer. So if the brown bunny could somehow, say, put a lot of sand on the Arctic and turn up the temperature and convert the Arctic into the desert, it would do so. That's niche construction. Now, of course, you can imagine that when excellence combines with excellence at niche construction, you get a very interesting dynamic. It turns the fitness landscape into a hill, and then it keeps it there. And then it becomes more and more excellent. So I have double order. Let's call it local excellence. I'm good at climbing this hill. Then I have global excellence. I'm good at keeping this hill taller and stable. Well, that was the great moderation of the Blue Church. One of the things the Blue Church was able to do was niche construct its own environment on a global basis and hold it constant. And it thought of that as being a very good thing. And complicatedness likes to keep complexity at bay. Let's keep the world from changing too much. We want to keep things more or less structurally the way they are. Like, allow it to evolve within bounds. But the structure, the primary components of particularly the tall part of the structure, and the fundamental content of the fact of the structure stays the same. And this turns into, for example, the notion of financial bubbles. Instead of letting financial crises actually wash all the way down through into the political level, for example, maybe even to the cultural level, and shift things at the cultural level that maybe could go for some growth. Holding it, keeping it static, preventing the EU from collapsing in 2010-11, right? And holding it, which of course creates an excellence. It creates a fitness landscape that reinforces what's already there. It puts more and more energy on it, because if you bet against the Greek debt when the EU bailed them out, you lost. And so you're gone. You're no longer on the board. And so there's a continuing cycle of that. But reality doesn't give a fuck. So reality is still there. Complexity and the fundamental nature of reality is still doing its thing. And by the way, as you begin to, the longer you keep the niche the way it is, you also start running into the complexity from the inside. You get the humanness, you get corruption starts to work its way in. And eventually you run into a collapse event. You run into some scenario where the interior, the structure, in this case the Blue Church, finds itself in a context that is in fact changing outside the boundaries of its ability to control through niche construction. And so what ends up happening is you get almost like a rubber banding effect. Instead of the niche changing like this, it kind of like wanted to change, wanted to change, wanted to change, wanted to change, building up pressure all over the place until eventually the ability to hold back the waters breaks, and you actually have a dam bursting phenomenon. Catastrophe, like catastrophe theory in math. Bubbles popping, dams bursting, ropes tearing, like there's a whole mathematical description of phenomena, the state shift between one state and another discontinuously. And that's what happens. Right? So that's to tell us where we are, is the Blue Church was really, really good at what it was doing. The best ever. I mean, we got 8 billion people under its stewardship, and broadly speaking, quite peacefully. And we've managed not to kill ourselves with a nuke, which is actually quite a bit of a feat. And the level of poverty has gone down, the level of wealth has gone up, lifespans are back to pre-agricultural levels, which is ironically funny to say, but is in fact the standard that we've gotten to. So people are living as long as we lived back 45,000 years ago. Although, by the way, not as healthily in that last 20 or so years. We've gone to the moon, can fly around. There's all kinds of awesome stuff has happened. But in the meantime, it's obsolete. Meaning both that the complexity of the world that we now live in, and largely as a consequence of communication technologies changing the velocity of change that's possible, and 8 billion people changing the amount of stuff that's being talked about. And as a consequence of all of our actuation capacity, lots and lots of cars and lots of large tankers shipping across the oceans, pushing the environmental system out of equilibrium along many, many different dimensions, not just CO2 or methane. The scope of what this complicated system needs to take responsibility for is now the whole thing. So it has to move from being able to take control of some defined domain, it has to actually take control of the whole. Enduringly. And in the meantime, so that's what I mean, the scope has gotten bigger, and it's outside the boundary capacities of what this kind of sense-making system could do at all.
Before we move off the Blue Church too much, I'd like to get the sort of the broadcast versus digital paradigm and the need for discernment.
Oh, great! All right. So let's do it in that context. Right, so
and the thinking versus simulated thinking.
So broadcast. So we're talking about a notion where broadcast is faced with a couple of different problems, and we're going to talk about it both from the outside and with those three domains. So from one perspective, broadcast has limitations in its capacity to perceive and respond to reality. It's pretty obvious, right? If you think about it, what's happening is every layer of the hierarchy has to compress the information. You know, if you were out in the field seeing what's going on with, say, the rainforest insects, and you're reporting it up to somebody who's at a think tank, who's reporting it up to a policymaker, who's reporting it up to a legislative decision maker, they're having to simplify a lot to go up the chain, right? So you're losing an enormous amount of information, which means that you can only do so much. It's kind of like if you imagine, remember those, like in the 80s, they had those glass spheres that if you touch them, lightning bolts would touch your fingers. So the sphere is the whole thing, and the broadcast modality is one of those lightning bolts. So it kind of like maneuvers around the sphere, but it can only handle that much, and that's not a lot. And that's just the nature of the structure. Right? Just a structure that has that kind of geometry to it can only perceive a certain fraction from the bottom to the top. And then, by the way, the same thing happens the other way down. The directives that are given from the top have to be, they have to be relatively simple, because as they go down, there's an expansion of scope, which adds basically noise, because the person down below has to add a whole bunch of specificity to what to be done, and as it gets handed down, you get more and more noise. And so this means at the top, the directives that come down have to be very broad and simple, and at the bottom, the divergence between what actually happens out in the world and what was intended in the top is actually quite large. And so you've got a lack of elegance and precision, and you get a compression going up. And so this means that it has certain capacities. It can actually get us to the moon. Turns out that's a domain that's well within the scope of what it can do. It cannot solve climate. Full stop, period. And there's a lot of other things it can't solve. So that's one boundary condition. The other boundary condition is this transition between broadcast and digital, which is happening. And so the Blue Church gave us digital. Right? We moved from an analog world to a digital world during its period of being in charge. And when I say digital here, I want to say very specifically what I mean is network, symmetric, decentralized. So the fact of it being digital is important. It's actually very, very important, but it's not the thing that I'm focusing on right here. I'm comparing broadcast to this network decentralized, not analog to digital, by the way. Both are true, but we're just going to focus at the network to broadcast piece. So what happens is that a network intelligence, a network system for sense making and choice making is different. Full stop. Let's just start there. It's just different. And it has different capacities. It has different ability to take information from the edge, process it, make choices, and disseminate actuation back out to the edge. And it's more available to solve all the problems that we're dealing with. It's a kind of collective intelligence topology that is fundamentally more available to being able to address complex systems problems. That's how our brain works, for example. But to use kind of a developmental metaphor, if the Blue Church is a really, really sophisticated, developed, and mature, aging boxer, the new digital collective sense making is a 4-year-old. All right, so he's got good genes. You can see he's going to be good when he gets strong, when he gets bigger. Maybe when he's 14, he'll be able to punch this guy out. But in the meantime, he's not a 4-year-old. But in the meantime, it's not really a match. If you look at it and say, hey, wait, in terms of lifting heavy weights, Blue Church is going to win. In terms of being able to answer a lot of questions, or at least appear to be able to answer a lot of questions, the Blue Church looks like it's quite robust. If you take a look at the emerging decentralized collective intelligence that's beginning to happen on the internet, it mostly looks like gaps. It mostly looks like it's doing stuff in the gaps that are being left behind by the Blue Church. It doesn't look like it can do anything holistic. And when it's endeavored to do something holistic, like so the QAnon phenomenon, it looks insane. And it kind of is. And if you've ever seen an absolute newborn baby in its body, it's insane. You know, its limbs are flailing wildly, its head's rolling around, its eyes are rolling in its head, because it hasn't figured out how to wire itself up yet. That's what's happening in the network collective intelligence. So there's a gap, there's a transition. But there's a whole new concept, OODA loop, if we want to do that when we can. There's very good reasons to believe that the Blue Church is done, meaning that it's in the senescence stage. And senescence has a characteristic where when you move into the senescence stage, you tend to go downhill pretty quickly. So I'm expecting to see the Blue Church sort of increasingly obviously failing, and increasingly obviously losing the habitual or unconscious or unspoken position of being authoritative and being just reality. Right? More and more people are going to be going, that's a thing. That's not the whole thing. It's a thing, and it's kind of doing something, and maybe parts of it are still good, but it's not the whole thing. And it seems to be increasingly fucked up. And in the meantime, looking around going, okay, now what? That's the key. Right now we're in a space. We're in that space between 1918 and 1945. We're in the space between 1077 BC and 800 BC, where there's a gap between a coherent collective intelligence, there's a coherent structure for being able to respond as a whole to what's happening, and a new one, not an old one, a new one, and they're fading. So we're witnessing that transition. We're in the middle of it. And a lot of the phenomena that we've been experiencing over the past 15 years or so, are of that sort, starting around 2000-ish. Particularly accelerating. You can explain a lot of the things that happened that seemed very inexplicable, like Brexit and Trump, using this model.
That partly it's about novelty building up behind the Blue Church and then exploding because it had nowhere to go.
Well, it has to do with gaps in the Blue Church, so blind spots and actuation gaps. That's one side. So it can't do the things that it thinks it can do, and it doesn't perceive. There's lots of things it can't perceive, kind of willfully, actually. And then on the flip side, the rapid evolutionary development of capacity in what I'm calling the red religion, or the decentralized collective intelligence, just to make it very clear. It's not The red religion just happens to be an instantiation of it, a way of solving the problem. So, there's a developmental curve. This idea of rate and state is pretty good here. So, blue church state of sense-making, choice-making, and actuation, high. Rate, down. It's getting less effective over time. Decentralized collective intelligence, state, low. Rate, high. Right? So there's going to be a crossover point. And what we see is, on occasion, we'll see a breakthrough where this new thing has reached a point of criticality where its capacities are now good enough to show up as actually effective in the visceral world vis-a-vis the fading legacy. And I think now it's actually becoming relatively commonplace to kind of see the struggle between blue church normative good opinion and new structures of sense making and new structures of meaning making and new structures of how those are beginning to try to cohere into actually sovereign collective intelligences that are able to do the whole thing. But we're a bit of the ways there, for sure. It'll take certainly single-digit years, and possibly double-digit years for the whole thing to come together to a point where it's transitioned formally.
Can we talk about discernment and how that's a key skill in decentralized media compared to broadcast media?
Oh, absolutely. So now the conversation, which I think is really nice, is turning to now what and how. So the answer now what is decentralized collective intelligence. Great. How? How do we do that? So I said first step is know that you don't know. Right? Know that most of your habits are blue church habits. In fact, most of your habits are even game A habits, but let's just leave it at blue church right now. And certainly everything you've been formally taught and everything you've learned from formal institutions, and almost all those are going to be wrong. So you have to actually step into a pretty child's mind place. And as a rule of thumb, go very slowly and don't try to come to action very quickly. Step by step. You have to learn, you have to stand before you walk. You have to walk before you run. And this is very much developmental. So within that context, what are some of the core capacities that are part of our developmental stage for us to actually be able to move this decentralized collective intelligence forward? And one of the core capacities is discernment. And I will distinguish discernment from, say, judgment or good opinion. So, and here I'd like to actually invoke the distinction between thinking and simulated thinking. So let me just do that distinction really quickly and then come back to discernment. So if we remember that a lot of a way of thinking about the fundamental structure of game A, and in this case, specifically the structure of the blue church, is computational in nature. There's a schema of information, which is simply true. And your job is to simply learn it as a schema, like know the map, and to be able to repeat it back with fidelity. And if there are if-then statements, to be able to execute on identifying what is the if, what's the pattern that is present, and then execute on the then. So, if I say red, press the red button. Your job is to be able to know that I said red, and then to press the red button. That's a computational function, bureaucratic game A. And when I'm in that mode, there's a optimization for being able to do that, which is to be able to do so quickly and with fidelity. I want to become a really good computer. I want to be able to do pattern recognition against the patterns that are available very rapidly and never get it wrong. And then I want to be able to output the appropriate output very rapidly and with high fidelity. I don't know if you ever played the game where you did math challenges where a kid would stand up, the kid next to them would stand up, the teacher would show like 4 times 4, and whoever said the answer right got to move. I think it's called Around the World. That is this, precisely. Right? Your job is to know your math tables down pat, to be able to see 4 by 4 before the other kid has even figured out what the board says. You're saying 8. That is a simulated intelligence optimization function. And then this other side, thinking, from simulated thinking to thinking is a very different gig. Thinking is, well, it's so different I have to actually slow down to even begin to articulate it. For example, when you absolutely have no idea what's going on, thinking is helpful. In fact, it's necessary. It's what you do. You have to be able to perceive a lot. I perceive subtly and multimodally. You like to be able to use your eyes and ears and anything else you happen to have as much as possible. And you want it to be very available to novelty, which means that you don't want to close what you're perceiving on something that you think it is. You don't want to impose a structure from your framework on what is real. So if you're walking through the woods and you hear something in the bushes, if you imagine it's a horrible monster and you panic, you're engaging in simulated thinking. If instead you stop walking and you listen and look, and you don't have any preconceived notion of what it is, you know exactly what you know, which is that I heard something and no more. And you tune yourself to just become increasingly capable of perceiving reality as fully as possible. And then as that reality reveals itself in clarity, making use of that and nothing more. I have just seen a flash of orange. I haven't seen a tiger. I just jumped to a conclusion there. I imposed sense-making on reality. I just saw a flash of orange. Okay. What else? Oh, it's up there. Oh, I also heard chirping. Oh, it's a toucan, right? You slow down and allow the perception to really settle in, and you allow your mind to even be quite open and fluid. You're in a flow state, right, to use that language. The closer you are to a flow state, and the more you are able to engage in insight, which is to say not be in the box, but actually be perceiving reality with a lot of fluidity to it. That's real thinking. Okay? And so discernment is the use of sensing in a very subtle way, like nuance and subtlety, and a broad net of sense, particularly with your whole instrument. Noticing, for example, that you actually do have a lot going on. You're not just eyes and ears. You're several billion years of biological evolution that had to fucking survive in the wilderness using whatever it had and didn't throw out the good stuff. Right? So all of that is here, and it's all more or less fully integrated into a very effective sense-making coherence as an individual. So to discern is to be able to attune your full perceiving and sense-making instrument, and to be able to use that fully in the context of reality without having any prejudgment collapse that listening. And then notice when some kind of quality of feeling shows up. And now to actually explain that, I have to go a little bit deeper. I have to make a distinction. And we keep having to make these distinctions because the world's gotten the world's been very sloppy, frankly, in making meaning of what's going on. So I want to make a distinction that's relatively well known in cognitive science between emotions and feelings and thoughts. So, and Damasio is the guy who I first learned this from. I'm not using his particular framework, but it's where it first came from, for me. So an emotion is a very physical shift in disposition poised for action. Okay, so you feel the emotion of fear. You're poising your body to flee. And as you begin to feel the building of that energy, what you're actually feeling is a whole bunch of stuff going on in your body that is beginning to shift the entire disposition of your body, and mind, by the way, to be able to change from sitting around to running rapidly. If you're feeling a building of an energy to begin to engage in conflict, to fight, we call that emotion anger. Right? So there's not that many emotions, and they are systemic and very biological, physical. Feelings are completely different. We actually feel our emotions, so we can get confused. We feel fear as well as, in fact, actually experience or have fear. But a better way of grasping feeling would be something like you're trying to stack a rock on top of another rock. and you're trying to notice whether or not the rock is balanced. That's feeling. A very integrative, systemic, subtle, and nuanced use of many, many, many different kinds of sensing and actuating simultaneously that are way beyond the capacity to do it analytically. Standing. It's a complex problem, standing on two legs, nonetheless. You have to be able to use all these different muscles, hundreds of muscles involved, and be able to sense whether you're, for example, are your knees buckling or are you falling to the left or the right? If you've watched a 1-year-old try to stand, you see how many failure conditions there are. You get this big thing on top that's actually rather ungainly. You have to figure out how to hold that appropriately. Standing is a feeling thing. The feeling of being balanced is what I mean by feeling. And then we can move that to a higher level of action. If you've ever shot a basketball, there's a feeling of shooting a basketball. You've trained your body to be fluidly able to execute an extremely complex effort of moving a sphere from here to there, possibly while being guarded by other people and in the air, and the fucking thing goes in. That's feeling, right? Now, thought is something that happens in a much narrower bandwidth. Conscious thought in particular. Like if your conscious awareness is measured in bits, not the many, many, many megabytes of information that have to be processed to have even the least amount of standing up. And so to the thinking process is a very distinct kind of thing than feeling. It's much more associated with this simulated thinking, to be honest. Simulated thinking is, in fact, when you just take thinking to be the whole thing, and you don't allow feeling to participate meaningfully in the equation. Implicit thinking is deeper. So if you think about implicit thinking, the way that John talks about it, what you have is, remember he even described that experiment where you had the series of alphanumeric codes that were like 10 digits long, so it was not the kind of thing that was available to thinking. It was larger than working memory. And you had a series of them. And it had an algorithm to define what they were, but you weren't going to be able to figure that out, no chance. But then when shown other hexadecimal codes, some of which did use that algorithm, i.e. match the pattern, and some of which it didn't, you could kind of tell. Much better than 50%, much better than random. But if you ask people, how did you know? The honest answer was, I have no idea. But I felt it. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so there's a functional capacity to be able to use the whole thing. By the way, the whole thing here too. Right? This whole brain includes a whole bunch of stuff, of which the prefrontal cortex is the super cool, awesome, tiny bit. But the visual cortex and the cerebellum are actually doing a whole lot of work. So being able to use the whole thing to make sense of what's going on, that's the beginning of discernment. Right? So you learn how to come into attunement. You learn how to bring your body into alignment with your mind and to use that whole thing to perceive. And then you allow feeling to emerge, which is the appropriate modality for this kind of thinking. And by the way, this is true in any type of this source. So discernment, for example, is how you do art. If you want to be able to express yourself artistically, you first feel a feeling with clarity, and then you allow that feeling to become expressed with skillfulness, which takes time, of course. And it's done, by the way, by feeling. And you feel the feeling, and then you take a color, and you notice whether or not that color corresponds, whether the color feels like the feeling. And you have to get good at noticing that correspondence, like balancing a rock. When you get good at it, you can now put a color on a piece of paper that feels like the feeling. And then you actually look at whether the line has the feeling of the feeling, and eventually you're a painter. So, discernment, attunement, feeling, clarity. So now you have to actually have the sense of when a feeling has actually come into clarity. When there's to me at least, it kind of feels like everybody's checked in. That there's an internal consensus. To whatever degree my ability to perceive and make sense of what's happening has done what it can. Not a whole lot more is going to emerge, and there's something about this that has a yesness to it, where I can say, like, I'm balanced. I'm not falling over right now. Yes, the rock is going to stay. It's it's great practice. Just put a rock on top of another rock and notice that you can in fact feel when it's going to stay. And you can do it with another rock. Maybe you can do 7 rocks. Same idea. I mean, you've got clarity. Yep, it's balanced, and you can step back. So you build clarity. Now the deep thing here, by the way, is what happens next is you can actually at that point have insight. This is, by the way, a shamanic practice, back to John's stuff. which is in this place of clarity, whatever it is that is coming clear, you may have a capacity to actually learn how to express something. Now's where thought comes back in, that is new. You may have actually changed yourself in some way in relationship to what's happening. And now, because you've changed, your capacity to now do out in the world has changed. So now we take back to talk about this discipline, this concept of discernment in the context of decentralized collective intelligence. So in centralized broadcast, for example, collective intelligence, it is mostly judgment. I have to be able to measure good opinion. I have to be able to know hierarchical relationships. I have to be able to output the appropriate output within the very narrow boundaries of what I'm allowed. I have a certain amount of artfulness that I can actually apply to the equation, but it's mostly fitting it in the box and then popping it up to the right place. Increasingly so, by the way, under niche construction. What's interesting, this is a huge meta story. It'd be interesting to see if you can actually figure out how to get this gigantic story into something that even vaguely hangs together. That'll be a neat trick. Because I'm about to jump to not just discernment and decentralized collective intelligence, but also remarkableness, what happens in response to niche construction, and what the equivalent of niche construction is in the domain of the remarkable. So, in decentralized collective intelligence, what ends up happening is there's a signal-to-noise dynamic as things move through nodes. So if you receive something from a node, from me, for example, I'm telling you, this is actually, here we are. I'm telling you something. I'm telling you something. If you listen to what I'm saying, and in yourself are able to find that part of what I am saying that feels true. Feels, right? Does not kick off emotions of greed or fight or flight or lust or whatever, but feels. There's a quality to it. And you've built that quality to a level of capacity where you're like, I don't understand exactly what is being said here. And most of it seems like it's kind of weird or noisy or cringeworthy. But there's a thread here that feels very strong. I'm going to separate that out. And now I'm going to skillfully express it back out. What you actually have now is a positive feedback loop filtering system. If every node is doing that, and by the way, let's do recursion, if every node is primarily focused initially on building its discernment and skillfulness in doing this process, right, then what ends up happening is the network is fucking amazing at making sense of subtlety. Right? You can take the perception, these subtle, broad, implicit pattern recognizers that we're all so gifted with, and grab very vague and weird, not quite knowing what's going on thing, put it into the system, and after a couple of turns, it's actually reified to a very crisp clarity that can be shared. Right? So that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to accomplish, is that process. And you notice how much of a burden is placed on the individual now. It's not like the broadcast modality, where most of your agency is limited to a very narrow band, and you're really relying on the causal structure that you're embedded in to do almost all the work. In the decentralized collective intelligence, for it to actually work, almost all of the agency is actually on the individuals. You have to have really, really effective, responsible individuals. And by responsible, what I mean is they're able to respond to the environment in the way that I'm talking about. They are not reacting. They are not shifting to a causal domain. They're not saying what they're supposed to say or rejecting because they're supposed to reject. They're listening and refining and doing the work of collaboration. Right? Think about collaboration, how collaboration works. You and I are collaborating on a song. If we're partners, we're really collaborating. I'm going to be like, oh man, I just had this crazy sense, and I play a terrible sound. But you're listening very closely, right? And you're good at it. You're good at listening very closely. And you're like, oh, you know what? Is it like this? And you play it back. And what you play back is actually closer to what I'm feeling. I'm like, oh yes, more like that. More like that. And then I'm like, okay, and then this. But now I'm actually a little bit better at it because it's more clear in me, because what you did was you refined it and expressed it back to me in a way that I couldn't perceive myself. But once I saw it, pop, that's insight. You just gave me an insight collaboratively, collaborative insight. So now I take it and I output something back to you. And now you're like, oh yeah, I totally get it. And then you drop into it. And now, boop, we're now a collective intelligence. Coherence is now happening in the fluid collaboration between us, and the things that can be produced are vastly more than what either one of us could have done separately. Now, of course, this requires that you have developed a certain level of discernment. I've developed a certain level of discernment. We're in a relationship that allows us to actually use that. And we can talk about what that means and what the requirements are. And then we've also built a certain level of skillfulness in expression, so that I'm not creating noise in expressing it. I'm actually making it more signal when I express it, more real, more true. I'm increasing the truth of the expression of the quality. So that's a pretty, I think, pretty concrete example that many people might be able to grasp. And the idea is that that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how to become real collaborators at scale. And well, we're getting better at it. We're actually learning it. Like, we're noticing, for example, that our most natural humanness has a lot of capability to separate bullshit from non-bullshit, authenticity from artifice. And authenticity can at least feel true. It may not feel good. Artifice can do a really good job of feeling good, but authenticity can feel true, even when it's kind of a clusterfuck, right? Even when it's not done exquisitely, particularly when it's hard. If it feels really true and authentic, there's something in there that your basic, deep humanness is like, all right, I can work with that. All right, where do we go from here? And by the way, I'm interested. And by the way, if there's openness, hey, we're just figuring this out. I'm trying. What do you got? And you send it back to me symmetrically because we're available. And I listen. And I hear you. Then we've actually created a relationship that has that feeling of trust in the relationship, which then creates an open channel to do more of it. Now, of course, we're rate limited. We're limited by our discernment. So we're always going to have to be doing work on improving the quality of our discernment in all the modalities that happen to be happening. And we are rate limited by our capacity to express. We have to get better and better at being able to express with clarity, with elegance, and with, what I want to say is fidelity, meaning we don't want to put stuff in it that doesn't belong in it. Right? I want to say something that is also subtly manipulative. I just got to tell the truth. Pure truth, to the degree in which I can. I'm going to fuck it up, but at least I'm not fucking it up with stuff that doesn't need to be there at all. Right? So I'm just expressing it. And what happens about that is very good news. And it's an extremely powerful process. And the process of collaboration that's available now, because we're all connected to each other, is unprecedented. And that has the capacity to solve all the problems we're dealing with. That kind of a decentralized collective intelligence with high discerning individuals, with clearly expressing individuals who are non-egoically, meaning they are not adding subtly or intentionally their own shit into the signal, but are actually simply endeavoring to share what is authentically perceived by them to actually feel true, back out with quality, is incomprehensibly capable of making sense and, by the way, making choices and doing things. So much so that it's sort of absurd that we just don't go there. You want flying cars and going to the stars. This will get you there. It'll solve everything. The amount of bandwidth that's available inside that domain is enormous. The problem, of course, is that it's hard at an individual level, and it's countercurrent. Now, we've been trained for generations to do the exact opposite. We've been trained for many, 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 many generations to insert egoic content in between everything that we do. We've been trained for several generations to be simulating thinking, not thinking. And so we've got to relearn all that stuff. And we have to be doing it here first. Each individual has to be able to take the responsibility and then learn to trust their own discernment in relationship. If I'm in a relationship with you and you are in fact trying to manipulate me, I have to be in this really weird, widely vulnerable state of actually listening, but then noticing in myself that there's a feeling that's a little off, and then being able to respond to that as well. Ideally to call it out. Ideally there's a way for me to exquisitely invite you into a higher level of integrity in yourself and in relationship, but also perhaps sometimes just to be able to make it safe for myself and for others. So that's it. That's the practice. As far as I'm concerned, that is the thing that more or less everybody should be doing right now full time. And everybody who's good at it should be doing it more, it should show up. If you are good at it, other people should be noticing that you're good at it And one of the things that they should be doing is sharing that fact, so that the collective intelligence begins the process of being able to point its attention away from, say, simulation and artifice and towards truth and towards capacity building and growth, as opposed to exploitation and plunder. And by definition, if you're attending to people who are helping you build capacity, you're building capacity. So these people are going to do better. So it's actually a good choice for everyone. It is a better choice for everyone to be endeavoring to play this new game. And the more people who are playing it better, the more obvious that is, because the more actual visceral capacity is showing up over here. And there's a rate equation that's exponential, by the way, that once it starts to hit, it starts to achieve criticality, escape velocity, and just blows past this old structure very rapidly. And so there we are, that metaphor of a 4-year-old, where this is, if you want to play basketball, you have an opportunity to draft LeBron James. He's 4. It'll take a while before he's able to actually take you to the NBA championship, but the opportunity exists to have him on your team right now. By the way, and Michael Jordan. They're all there. They're just on the playground. They're 4. They're not that good right now, but in a little while they're going to be amazing. And maybe even at 12, like if you imagine 5 of the greatest NBA players of all time playing as 12-year-olds, might actually be a pretty freaking good team. So it's kind of that's it. That's the story.